So before I begin, I want to acknowledge that I am joining you today from Western Australia, from the lands of the Noongar people of the Whadjuk Nation. I want to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and to recognize that their sovereignty has never been ceded. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. This is how we begin most of our meetings here in Western Australia. And since I now belong in many places, including this one, I always like to begin my engagements by acknowledging the land on which I live and work and think. So I really want to thank you for the honor of this invitation. I'm always intimidated by the academy. So I play around the edges, as your introduction has noted. I play around the edges of the academy. I like to have the fellowships that allow me in and out, give me access to journals so I don't have to pay for them myself when I'm doing my research. But I'm certainly not from the academy. I think outside it, and I am drawn to it and love what it affords us. And so this is not going to be the lecture of an expert, but it is the lecture of someone who's deeply interested and engaged in the questions that you are all thinking through as part of the Congress. So thank you very much. So I have two objectives today. The first is to address this question of African-centered psychology. And the second is to talk through this crisis. What is this crisis that we are to tend to as South Africans, that we find ourselves living through and within as a nation? I am, as I've said, neither a psychologist nor and I'm an academic, although in the course of preparing this lecture, I've certainly had a lot of practice in spelling the word psychology. I always get it wrong. I am, however, someone who has invested time and energy into thinking about stories. And as part of the brief, as we were preparing for this conversation, I was asked to think about the work that I do as a storyteller, and so to bring that element into my remarks. And so increasingly, I tell stories, and I'm asked to help people to share their own deeply held personal stories. I'm also aware that these days I am as much a stranger to South Africa as I am an intimate. I live very far away, and I have the luxury of distance. I see South Africa these days very differently to how I saw it when I first left home in 2015. I've been in and out a lot, of course, but COVID prevented me for 2 years from coming home, and that was very difficult. I was last home in April, and that was wonderful. But it was difficult for me to be away from South Africa. But with the distance, I think, have some reflections. So let's begin with this first task, which is to think about psychology and race through the prism of storytelling. Racism, as we all know as South Africans, provides an old script for understanding who Black and white people are. And the story of race, which is of course an invented idea, carries with it some very powerful fantasies that have profound implications for the carrying out of your discipline. These stories are damaging for everyone, for white practitioners as well as for Black ones. For Black practitioners, racial bias in patients can be traumatizing. For example, a Black woman therapist who is seen as a nanny figure by a white patient because of our racialized history may find herself in a difficult position, undermined and re-traumatized by someone she is seeking to assist. Even as an educated, highly trained person in a position of relative power, she may not be able to fully escape the story of South Africa as a place where Black people take care of white people, where white people are entitled to Black care. Racism, of course, also has profound effects on the people who you have in your care. You serve those who are victims and survivors of racial discrimination and abuse, and you also interact with and are in a position to help those who perpetrate racial harm. In other words, race matters in psychology, as it matters in everything in South Africa. Regardless of who you are, regardless of your own race, if you live in South Africa, race indeed matters. And so in the wake of the American summer of 2020, after the public murder of George Floyd and the global protests that followed, it's become impossible to ignore the effects of racism on any academic or practical discipline. And yet, of course, as conversations about race have become more and more commonplace, and as every discussion turns to decolonization, I myself have begun to be a little bit skeptical of the term. Decolonization, a powerful idea, has begun to lose some of its subversive power. Instead, many universities have co-opted the language and praxis of decolonization. And so, much like in the feminist work that I do, much like intersectionality, decolonization has become jargon, emptied of its meaning in service of institutional agendas that sometimes have a way of swallowing movements and diffusing the sharpness and difficulty of critique, which is what, of course, lends it its power. This doesn't mean that we should stop challenging, critiquing, seeking to transform, to indeed decolonize oppressive systems and practices, but it does mean that we have to become clearer about the traps of language. We have to become more strategic about how we deploy the words that we use. I am, of course, fully aware that I am speaking to a room not only of practitioners, but of academics and researchers. But one of the biggest impediments to decolonization, I think, is the word itself. Complicated and inaccessible language keeps people out. It prevents them from understanding what we are talking about, and it is often disempowering and abstract. And of course, as a writer and as a storyteller who works a lot with community-based organizations, I spend a lot of my time working with migrant and refugee communities here in Australia to help them to say what they mean, supporting them to move away from language that hides their feelings and embrace ways of speaking that are more direct. And so in the course of this lecture, I want to talk about some of this work that I do in storytelling as a way into thinking about the interlocking social and political crises with which we are faced as a nation. But in order to do that, of course, we have to define the nature of the crises that we are staring down. We are faced with, in my view, at root, a crisis of trust, a grand and spectacular explosion of public and private confidence in politicians, in community leaders, in men, in sports heroes who we once adored. And to make it worse, these days, I think we have no story. No longer do we have an explanatory model with which we can understand how we went from being the darling of the world, a place of infinite possibility, to a country that can barely keep the lights on. And so I think we have been both betrayed in objective terms through the theft and corruption and all of the things that we see on the headlines and we know. But we have also in many ways betrayed ourselves, because for the longest time, South Africans have bought into this singular story. We have told ourselves that we are exceptional, that we are not like the rest of the African continent to which we belong. The crises we now face can only be addressed if we begin by accepting that at the fundament, we are no better than our neighbors. Our problems derive from the same processes and structures of colonization as their problems. And so the solutions will come from the same places. And if we accept this truth, we might begin to build a new set of stories. Stories that refuse to center the so-called liberators, stories that also don't center the former oppressors. And this is a very difficult task, to not center either the liberators or the former oppressors. A new set of stories must center the experiences and wisdom of ordinary South Africans. Because by now we know that there are no saviors and we will have to pull ourselves out of the quagmire in which we find ourselves. So let me preface some of my comments by saying a little bit about my own personal journey. I grew up in exile, the child of freedom fighters, so-called liberators, and my family returned to South Africa after Mandela left Robben Island. I studied politics and gender, and I worked in women's health and HIV before broadening my approach to look at democracy, media, freedom of expression, etc. And I headed up a very big organization that worked across Southern Africa, addressing the emerging human rights crises in Zimbabwe and Swaziland and the DRC throughout the mid-2000s. And it was exciting and exhausting. And of course, at the time when I was deeply engaged in all of these questions about democracy and what our story was as South Africans throughout the TRC process, etc., I was also a new young mother who had taken an interesting decision to marry an Australian. And 8 years ago, after 15 years at home, that Australian decided that we should move. It was his turn, he said, to spend time with his aging parents and to raise our children near their other relatives on this side of the ocean. It was hard to argue with that within the logics of a relationship. Those of us who have been in long-term partnerships will understand how difficult that can be. But leaving South Africa was very, very, very difficult for me. And in many ways, it spurred somewhat of a personal crisis. South Africa has always been a core part of my identity. And in the years since apartheid had ended, I had not been able to understand myself apart from my country. Stripped of South Africa, I literally felt that I had no story. You might say, to use psychological language, that I had a deeply codependent relationship with my country. And I was going somewhere that could not have been any more different to my own country. Although Australia has a similar history of white colonization and settlement to South Africa, it is a white majority country. And on paper, at least, it is also one of the most equal and most prosperous countries in the world. South Africa, as we know, is not. South Africa is an African majority country, albeit one in which a white minority continues to enjoy disproportionate institutional power, though these days, less and less cultural power. I was surprised when I was back in Joburg this last time in April, how much Johannesburg has changed, how much of an African city it really is. South Africa is also one of the most unequal countries in the world, as we all know, and it is rapidly becoming one of the least prosperous. And we have this large but ailing economy, and our economic outlook is characterized by shrinkage rather than growth. And before it gets too depressing, I will be honest, for all of our problems as South Africans, we are far more fun, far more vibrant than the place in which I now find myself. But there are also important differences between our societies, and these reveal themselves at the level of narrative, when we think about the stories these two places tell themselves. Australia tells itself that it's a classless society, and this is not entirely true, but our myths, as you would all know as psychologists, tell us as much about who we are as they do about who we want to be. And so Australia clearly wants to be a place where wealth does not fundamentally determine opportunity. This is an aspiration that has produced a relatively flat society and a culture that celebrates working class heroes and it glorifies the underdog. I remember when I first moved here, I was stunned because there was some television footage of the prime minister getting into, his vehicle to go from one meeting to another. And he sat in the front seat. An impossible thing in most other countries in the world. He sat in the front seat because to sit in the back seat would be to signal that you think, even as prime minister, that you are superior to the person who's driving the car with you. And so every prime minister in Australia sits right up front next to the driver. So this tells you something about the story that Australia tells itself about who it is. In South Africa, of course, our founding myth is not so much that we are a rainbow nation, although for a time, I think that idea was prevalent. And it's not even so much that we are a place of equality, because I think we all know that we are not. Our founding myth is that we are on the cusp of greatness. and that the state of greatness we are about to achieve is always measured against a first world standard. So even as we slide backwards on every metric in terms of our economy, this myth continues to prop South Africans up. It gives us boundless optimism, which is good, but of late, as we all know, it has begun to take a very dangerous turn. The idea that we are about to achieve greatness is also a myth of exceptionalism that divorces us from our African reality and that places us within striking distance of the West. So the idea in South Africa has always been that we are this first world country in an African context. Yeah? This phrase comes up repeatedly. It's ironic, of course, given the relationship that most South Africans have had to racism and colonization, to this first world. It's almost like a form of Stockholm syndrome. Having been told that we were inferior, and then having been abandoned by most of the governments of the Western countries throughout the period of apartheid, those who continued to invest in apartheid, once we attained our freedom, we immediately began to invest our energy in trying to be like those who once spurned us. Or if I am to be generous, and I think we would say this about someone like Thabo Mbeki, in proving to them that we can be like them. We too could have McDonald's. We also could host exorbitantly expensive international sporting competitions. Poor people be damned. And we could boast about shiny new airports for tourists, even as our rail network, a key to economic growth, crumbled and more jobs were lost. This tendency to prove our first worldness is evidence that the apartheid project was successful. Its racism taught us to see the rest of the continent as a backward place. It taught us that national success looked like simultaneously leading Africa, as though Africa was waiting to be led by us, and pulling away from the continent culturally and economically at the same time. The idea that we are special and on the verge of catching up to the West always had within it the seeds of chauvinism, but it has become increasingly toxic in recent years. As the material conditions of ordinary South Africans deteriorate, the idea that we stand apart from Africa has led to increasingly xenophobic and what we would call Afrophobic attitudes. The Put South Africa First movement, the rhetoric and the violent actions of men like Nhlanhla Lux and his Operation Dudula are prime evidence of how dangerous the idea of exceptionalism has become. I will admit, like most of us, in the early years of the transition from apartheid to democracy, I embraced South African exceptionalism. I was proud. I did not understand that it contained within it the seeds of the crisis that we are finding ourselves in now. It seemed innocuous, grounded in the idea that this country represented the one place in the world where dignity could thrive, despite the racism that had gone before us. I was proud of the South African miracle, in awe of the spectacular leadership that had helped us to transition without imploding. What I didn't understand then, and what I think we have all come to see much more clearly, was that the story of the peaceful transition was true, but it wasn't the only story. And I think we have to create space to recognize that those transition years were a time of great anger, great pain, great grief for those who were caught up in the violence. Those years were painful for women who were raped by jack rollers, and those who were subjected to terrible abuse by men who had been sent to Namibia and Angola to fight. The numbers of people caught up in the vortex of rage and chaos that defined those years is significant. And we continue to live with its legacy. And of course, we also know that even as negotiations were happening, the security forces were escalating their rates of violence in the early 90s in the townships, and increasing detention and torture during this period. We also have to recognize, I think, that while Mandela's extraordinary charisma carried us forward with rugby matches and powerful symbols, there were many people who were not prepared to forgive the past regimes for its actions, and that many of us still have not healed. Again, important inflection points for those of you who are dealing with this notion of healing the mental health of the nation. And at an even more fundamental level, I think it is time we begin to tell ourselves that no matter how soaring the political rhetoric of the time, the scale of poverty that we faced then, even then in 1994, and the even bigger burden of poverty that we now carry meant that people continued to live in terrible and terrifying conditions, even as we sold this story about ourselves being a rainbow nation, being a miracle, and being on the cusp of achieving great things. Yeah? That growth, that economic growth has always been about to happen to South Africa, and yet it has never happened. So the story South Africa sold the world and itself was inspiring for a time, but that story has done nothing to address the emotional and physical trauma that people face on a daily basis as they navigate crime, unemployment, poor health services, chronic homelessness, you name it, yeah? And one of the stories that I told myself as a middle-class Black person was that South Africa was this moral beacon, a place that could prove that we could achieve dignity of everybody, regardless of their social circumstances. And this idea in many ways has been the animating idea of my life. It has guided and dictated my own actions, it determined my upbringing, my career choices, etc. It helped me decide what I was going to fight for and who I was going to fight against. But I think, like many South Africans today, I am grappling with what it means to discover that for the vast majority of Black South Africans who have lived all of these years in poverty, our country's claim as a lighthouse is hollow now and has been hollow for a long time. It is not translated in practical ways, and so the story, which was once a hopeful story and true to the extent to which we wanted to make it true, is now a lie. And it saddens me greatly, as I'm sure it does many of you. 8 years ago, when I left South Africa and moved to Australia, like many of my fellow South Africans, I still firmly believed in our founding myth. I thought that our rainbow story meant that we were on the verge of that first world trajectory, that we were on the rise. Even though it was 2015, deep into the Zuma years, and all of the signs were already pointing in the wrong direction. But as a Black middle-class person, as a beneficiary of the dividends of that transition, the story I had in my head about South Africa was far more powerful than the evidence that was looking at me every single day. I needed to believe the story. Today, our exceptionalism has created movements born out of the idea that if we could just rid ourselves of the burden of these African immigrants, of the taint and stench of Africa, then we might still be able to catch up. It's still possible that the story might still be true if we can just rid ourselves of this Africa within us, the people pouring across the borders. Of course, the reason we are not progressing economically has nothing to do with migrants and everything to do with our failure to grow the economy. Indeed, for all of our arrogance about not being like the rest of Africa, we are objectively no better than our neighbors in all of the most important economic ways. The South African rand, when I last checked it about 2 days ago as I was preparing for this, is almost on par with the Zambian kwacha in terms of where we measure against the US dollar. Mozambique's economy is growing at almost 6%, whereas ours is projected to grow at 1.8% in 2023-24. In Malawi, youth unemployment is 9.8% this year, up from 8.3% because of COVID. And in South Africa, youth unemployment is at a startling 59%. So the metrics show us that the story we are telling ourselves about how close we are to touching that first world status, how far away we are from the rest of our neighbors, is actually not true. And so while longing for home has sometimes made me romanticize South Africa, being far from home has helped me to understand how much in denial. Again, I hope you appreciate how I'm dropping in phrases from a psychology perspective. How much in denial we are as a country. How even as we coexist with the ongoing failures of the state, we believe ourselves to be exceptional and on a path towards prosperity. We are simultaneously angry about load shedding, water shortages, and the worst unemployment figures, and deeply convinced that we are not like the rest. And this myth of relentless progress happens even as we decline. And so there has to be a language. There has to be a language that we develop to talk about this, to explain to ourselves in ways that don't blame other people. Because the truth is that over the last 30 years, we have not shifted our national narrative. We do not have the type of political leadership that can shape a new national discourse across the political spectrum. If we try to challenge ourselves to think who has the creativity and the intellect and the compassion to reframe our story, who is it who we can say has that? And I think the answer has to be us. Everyone in this room knows how to tell a story. In the absence of a new political story to inspire and unify us, the work of storytelling and sense-making has to fall to all of us. And though it is difficult, I think it is far more helpful for us as a country to diversify our stories, to not rely on one or two voices, no matter how glorious those voices, Madiba, Desmond Tutu, etc., no matter how glorious those voices may be, I think we have always needed to have many, many voices. I remember talking to a friend as I prepared to leave, in 2015, and lamenting, what am I going to do? What am I going to do there? So many of my dreams for myself are linked in with my dreams for South Africa. And she said, and it's turned out to be very true. She said, wherever you go, there you are. You will bring your passions and your obsessions to that new place. And so if you fast forward 8 years, I found a place for myself through work as what I'm starting to call a public conversationalist, someone who is committed to the public sphere, to the exchange of ideas that expand rather than shrink the range of possibilities for what we do as societies. And I've realized that my story is not reliant on the story of my country. It's a bittersweet realization, but one I think is helpful for all of us to think through. No matter where you live as a South African, I think it is important for us to think about how we try to break away from believing in a narrative that no longer reflects our reality and in beginning to shape a new one. There, of course, isn't a perfect match between working on personal stories in the way that I do in my methodology and national stories, but I think there are enough synergies to make for a bit of a useful conversation. So in my work, which is based with the place called the Center for Stories, I work with 5 core principles of storytelling. And they're very, very simple, but I think in many ways they are helpful for us to think about how at a community level, at an individual level, and even perhaps at a national level, we might begin to do this work of helping to shape stories. So the work I do focuses on true first-person stories. The stories are delivered orally, and I help people to speak their stories rather than to write them down, because something different happens in your mind when you speak your story. We are people who are steeped in orality rather than always in writing. And speaking stories is far more accessible for people who are not conversant with English as a first language, etc. For lots of reasons, speaking stories is helpful. So first, we begin by defining a story in the simplest terms possible. A story is a series of events plus meaning. So it's what happened and one sense you make of what happened. And telling your story allows you to share wisdom, that unique insight that only you know in the ways that you know it, because only you have walked the path that you have walked. And then we talk about providing a scaffolding for our stories, the principles that guide how and why we tell stories. And so I just want to run quickly through with you the principles of storytelling that I work with. The first principle is to tell the truth. It doesn't matter whether the story is funny or sad when you're working with a group of storytellers. Some people will have a funny story, some people have a sad story. It doesn't matter. What matters is that at root, the story is true. It needs to be in its essence true. If it's not, it's a fiction, and you are breaking a contract with those who will listen to you, with your audience, and with the community that you are building of storytellers and story listeners. The second principle is that every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And you cannot tell the story until it's over, because you don't fully understand its meaning. So we share what we have learned rather than that with which we are still grappling. And I recognize, of course, that for psychologists, this may not be exactly what it is that you do, right? Because you are helping people along the journey of grappling. But I think there's something incredibly powerful and cathartic around helping people to tell the things that they know for sure, to share the journeys that they have finished, even as they may be grappling with other journeys. The third principle that I use in the storytelling that I do with communities is to recognize that everybody has a story to tell, and you can never be too privileged or too unimportant to tell the story. And so typically what will happen is when we convene together in a room and we are learning this practice of storytelling, there will be somebody, typically somebody with a lot of cultural and institutional power, who will say, I'm just going to listen. I'm not going to share my story because, there's other people who have suffered, and so I'm just going to listen. And then there will be somebody who is typically from a group or from a life experience in which they have been made to feel small, and they will say, I'm not going to share, my story doesn't really matter. And those are two ends of a spectrum that I think it's very important for us to understand what's happening there. Because the person who chooses not to share their story, as we saw many white South Africans did during our period of transition, when Black people were moving forward and sharing at the TRC, the withholding of your story is the holding on to power. It is a refusal to be vulnerable. And so I insist, as a trainer in my methodology, that everybody comes to the circle as equals. We may not be able to replicate that outside, but it is a powerful, and I will use the phrase decolonial practice to insist that everybody in the circle has an equal voice. And similarly, that the person who feels that their story is unimportant, that they, if they feel comfortable, have a space to share and listen as well. So the third principle is you can never be too privileged or too unimportant to share your story. The fourth principle is that we tell our own stories, not the stories of others, because there is an ethics around storytelling. And again, those who have power often speak on behalf of those who do not. Those who have power find it easier to ventriloquize those who have lived through difficult situations. And so people will say to me, well, I don't have a story of suffering, but let me tell you about my Aboriginal friend. Yeah? Because again, that is a withholding of vulnerability, a way that we have of allowing ourselves to speak, to take up space in the room without sharing our own pain or grief or humor or whatever it is that we want to share. And then, of course, the last principle is probably a principle around which you will disagree with me. But because I always preface it by saying I'm not a therapist. And so because I am not a therapist, I encourage those who participate in our workshops and in our sharing experiences to tell their stories from their scars and not from their wounds. And that means that if a story is not finished, if a wound has not yet healed, then your relationship and your capacity to publicly speak about that experience is much more difficult. and that in a world in which we constantly re-traumatize people by asking them to speak about things that they may not be ready for, what I've learned in the last few years is that if you take care of the storyteller, if you allow them privacy, if you allow them not to share, if you accept that some things are none of our business until people choose to make them our business, if you take care of the storyteller, then the story will take care of itself. And so working with these 5 principles, I think that if we turn our attention back from the personal to the political, and we think about South Africa and the stories that we are trying to tell about our country, where does that take us? Does it move us out of a sense of collective delusion about who we are? When we dare to be vulnerable and to tell our stories, I think we as people, non-politicians, not the people who have let us down, but we as people, I think, are far more truthful than the politicians whose paths we have followed. If we insist on seeing our stories through to the end, to telling our stories only once we know something for sure, when we have the wisdom that a particular set of experiences teach us, if we speak only then, how can we help others? How much more could we help others when we share wisdom rather than speaking before our ideas and our experiences are cooked? If we value all stories equally and insist that everyone can speak and has a place to speak and is safe to speak, is it not more likely that we will be moved to address the crises faced by others? In other words, the act of sharing stories is also an act of listening to stories. It is also an act of building empathy. If we speak for ourselves and not for others, if we insist that we will tell our own stories, not the stories of others, and if we share stories of others, we do so in ways that recognize how we are implicated in our lives, are we not more likely to tell the truth rather than imagining and projecting? And lastly, of course, if our shared stories seek to heal rather than wound, if we share what we have learned rather than speak from our fear, imagine what stories we might tell. So in conclusion, I think that my work at the intersections of storytelling and social inclusion has helped me to understand that supporting people to tell their personal stories requires this commitment to walking the narrow path between despair and possibility. It requires a capacity to amplify. It requires listening, above all, to hear people's stories for what they are and not what I wish them to be. And as people charged with addressing the multiple crises that South Africans face as they navigate the stress of poverty and the anxiety that accompanies violence and economic uncertainty, the uncertainty that comes with what COVID has wrought, which is a new phase both of mass illness and deepening poverty, you are all in uniquely powerful positions. Whether you are a researcher, whether you are someone who is in practice seeing patients, whether you are a teacher of psychology, you are in a remarkably powerful position to help people to think about, claim, and own their stories. And in that way, to help South Africans to understand how we have to shift the national narrative, not by creating some new mythology, but by increasing the number and diversity and cacophony of stories, so that what is true is what we know from those around us, rather than what it is that politicians tell us about how exceptional we are and how on the cusp of greatness we may or may not be. If there's anything we have learned since 1994, it is that we cannot rely on politicians to save us. If we are to rise to some kind of greatness, and I believe that we can, a greatness of spirit, an achievement of social and economic and ethical standards for how we live, it will be because we have marshaled the honesty, the clarity, and the wisdom required to write a new chapter in the story of South Africa. As one of my favorite people, Professor Njabulo Ndebele, reminds us constantly, the task of the storyteller is to move beyond testimony, beyond symbols, beyond the spectacular. The stories we must enable must be ordinary and vulnerable and made in our own voices. I thank you.